Hi, Survey 2 students. We're back for a mini lecture on Chapter 31 with respect to Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. We're still talking about the 19th century. We're talking about mostly in France and mostly after 1850. So we're going to be talking about the 1860s and 70s and 1880s. The terms Japonisme, Divisionism, en plein air, and avant-garde are going to be our terms as we look at Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. And you can see some of the stylistic characteristics under Impressionism there through the bullet points. So make sure you understand those bullet points as stylistic characteristics of Impressionism. I have a study session opportunity for you in this lecture as well. I'll come back to that screen for a second. The study session opportunity is to go to this Google Doc, which will also be in an email that you'll receive. And if you respond to two of the artworks meaningfully, you can't just write one sentence, but like meaningfully respond to the questions, you can get a study session attendance for that. So when we're talking about the avant-garde, that just means kind of moving forward the front ranks of any kind of military endeavor, but we're talking about those who are basically going against the academy. So we talked about how Courbet really went against the academy with Brillat-Ornon. He created his own kind of pavilion of realism. And then when there were those like Manet, so many were refused from the salon, from the academic tradition in France, that there actually was created a Salon de Refusés in 1863. So a place to exhibit works that had been rejected from the academy. And then later in the 1870s and 1880s, there were artists like those who we now consider Impressionists who exhibited their work in independent galleries as well. So the Salon de Indépendant or others. So there's your study session opportunity. Go to the Google Doc for more directions. It has to be done by March 29th, so another due date there, or you kind of forfeit that opportunity. So this is one of the works on that opportunity. Manet is different than Monet. It's really important to understand that. He's usually considered a realist, and he really was important in kind of moving art forward from considering it as something that had to be beautiful and representing some sort of transparent view of quote unquote reality. So he considers himself a painter of modern urban life. And he doesn't idealize. He doesn't idealize people. He doesn't use brushstrokes to idealize. And he uses kind of understanding of past art history, actually, to reference some of those sorts of classical or academic tendencies, like the idealization of the female nude or refined brushwork and that sort of thing, or even illusionistic space. So in this work, for example, he's playing with all those. He doesn't idealize the female nude. He presents her as very flat and very looking out at us in a direct way. 3D illusion space, like from the Renaissance, here is kind of confusing. Brushwork gets even more blurred as we look into the back where that woman is bathing. Why is she bathing there? There's no clear narrative. These figures are actually taken from a Renaissance print, but updated to look like bourgeois flaneurs of Paris, which are people who kind of just wandered around and looked at people and people watched. And this was rejected from the Salon in 1863. Critics talked about this commonplace woman of the demi-monde, or the demi-monde would be like the lower world, like the lower class, naked as can be, so not idealized, shamelessly lolling between two dandies dressed to the teeth. This is a young man's practical joke, a shameful open sore. So people thought it was an ugly, hideous painting, partly because of the flattened surfaces, loose brushwork, not corresponding with that kind of three-dimensional illusionism, not corresponding with those kinds of ideals. So when you compare to the kind of Renaissance classicism, that kind of academic training, Manet is purposefully rejecting that. and yet recalling it in the compositional structure with the seated youths and the naked woman, but totally just basically putting his middle finger up towards that tradition. And that figural group is one that he's taking again from that Renaissance print of Raimondi. The 1863 work of Manet's The Olympia, similarly rejected, hated by critics. Again, this woman was seen as a prostitute and looking out directly, even looking down at us. Daumier made a little print, again, where people are looking at it confused and shocked and like mouths agape. They were shocked by the cat at the foot of the bed. They were shocked by the Black woman seemingly bringing flowers to this prostitute from her John, shocked by this woman directly looking down at us, so gender roles, shocked by the flatness of the space. Again, it looks like, what's going on? How is this three-dimensional? There's just a vertical line there. And again, in the reference to Renaissance tradition, all of it is a purposeful thumbing of nose in that flatness, in the non-idealization of this woman, in her direct gaze, in the substitution of a black cat for a dog, no longer representing fidelity. So a total thumbing of nose. You know, I like to bring in contemporary scholarship. We know who the Black woman was. It was a nanny, a servant named Laura. And there were other studies of Laura by Manet. And there's a good article in the Art Bulletin about that. So if you're still kind of confused about what the Academy or the salons presented, this was one of the winners of the salon, Bouguereau's Nymphs and Satyrs. So clearly idealized females, a light source that illuminates their soft skin, three-dimensional illusionistic space, a mythological subject matter, a clear narrative, in stark contrast to that lack of idealization, flatness of surface, a modern subject of a prostitute. Similarly, Whistler's Nocturne in Blue and Gold actually brought forth a lawsuit by Whistler because it was so criticized. John Ruskin, a British critic, and Whistler is a British artist, just thought this was total impudence. Impudence is like talking back. Cockney is referring to a low-class person in London. To get 200 guineas is like talking about 200 pounds, like the amount of money. And this is really, it's looking at abstraction. This is the beginnings of moving away from trying to depict the natural world illusionistically or realistically, but rather capturing impressions. And similarly with Monet, capturing impressions of the light, a fleeting moment, loose brushwork. And here too, the Impressionists exhibited outside of the salon. Their work was criticized. Louis Leroy wrote, "Wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished than that seascape." So your grandma loves Impressionism now, maybe your mom, maybe you love Impressionism. But at the time, it was avant-garde. It was totally against the academic tradition. So in the US, we have artists still using this kind of realistic mode, like the Lifeline here. Winslow Homer also created lithographs for magazines. We've already seen Thomas Eakins in the Chapter 31 first lecture, creating these realistic scenes here, like photography, refined brushwork of a real surgery hall. Henry Ossawa Tanner is an African-American artist who kind of is looking back to Rembrandt, creating these narratives or scenes of African-Americans doing moral things, in this case saying grace at the table. So let's move on to Impressionism and understanding those bullet points that were in the first slide, the fleeting moment, this interest in light, and capturing a moment in time, really. And it's always typically fairly bourgeois. So bourgeois, again, as a class, not lower class, but bourgeois, right? So we've seen already Manet working under that kind of thumbing his nose at the Academy. He does dabble in Impressionism as well. You saw this image of the Bollier Frères within the Cult of Progress video from Thursday. And this is a later work where he's using that looser brushwork. And again, it seems to be that she is serving a man, not just alcohol, but as she looks out at us, there's a kind of sadness in her gaze. So you will be familiar with Monet, probably, the loose brushwork that he uses, his interest in capturing the effects of light over time. He does series, like the series of the haystacks. He does series like the facade of Rouen Cathedral, where light is captured over a series of time across as it falls. I particularly am interested in the Gare Saint-Lazare. This also was shown in the Cult of Progress video, because the freight train itself is, and the locomotive itself, the steam engine is itself a modern technology. And so what the subject becomes is the capturing of these water vapors, this fleeting moment of time, the time of movement, and the time of the change from steam into air. So very much a modern subject depicted in a modern way, trying to capture it, those fleeting moments of the train leaving the station, the fleeting moments of water into steam. And so thinking again about modernity, photography on the one, the iron at the Crystal Palace, the glass, or depicting here the Gare Saint-Lazare in this loose brushwork. Very different media, clearly, but something to think about. I hope that you can revisit that. Gustave Caillebotte usually is considered an impressionist. Here again, the modern subject, and influenced by photography. We would never see in a Renaissance painting someone who is cut off at the edge. And this kind of modern cityscape, the people not looking at us, kind of wandering, as it were. We've talked about this as a composed composition. Again, people seemingly cut off, so that that photographic, there's only so much that the lens can take in. So just to revisit again, thinking about modernity as the transient, the fleeting, the contingent, capturing these fleeting moments, these leisurely activities, capturing time. Some impressionists like Degas were influenced by Japanese woodblock prints, and we'll see that. That's what's known as Japanism. When Japan opened her ports in 1850, Europe was flooded with this visual information. And we'll see also artists go outside, like Monet, capturing the haystacks or Rouen Cathedral, using the new oil paints and tubes to do so. I've already mentioned avant-garde. So Degas also is cropping his compositions. You can see that here, and really redefining a significant moment. Why paint ballerinas? Why paint ballerinas at rest? And yet, it seems like we're interested in what these young ladies are doing. Degas would go into these studios and sketch, and then return to his own art studio to create the painting itself. And so again, you see this loose brushwork, you see an interesting composition where there's nothing in the center, but rather the figures are on either side and top and bottom. He was influenced by Japanese prints, again, this notion of Japanisme, here using pastels to represent a woman at her bath. So again, redefining a significant moment. Why paint a woman at her bath? But this kind of like fleeting moment of washing, right? And a beautiful moment too. Mary Cassatt, similarly influenced by Japanese prints and these blocks of color that comes from the woodblock, but in her case too, using aquatint and draw point etching. So using a different printmaking technique, but that still gives that effect of blocks of color. And the subject matter, again, one that is transient, one that is modern, one that is influenced also from Japanese prints. Here, a woman at her bath. Mary Cassatt worked a lot in France, but was of American citizenship. Bertha Morisot, also working in France, a female painter, capturing these moments of the bourgeois kind of life of women. So seated with children or in a boat, capturing the effects of light on water. Renoir captures the effects of light here, this kind of dappled light through the trees as bourgeois individuals are dancing and having a luncheon. La Moulin de la Galette is like this luncheon party. And so they're kind of partying, right? These people in their fancy hats and having a good time, and all loose brushwork and dappled effects of the light, the sun through the trees. So as we move into post-impressionism, at some point, this kind of interest in light gets played out. And post-impressionists like Cézanne or Van Gogh are going to start thinking about either the emotional effects of color, that's what Van Gogh does, or like Cézanne will do, really look at color as something that can be almost analyzed as a constructive device. So constructing compositions through color. And I hope that you will be able to kind of see these differences, color as emotion or color as a constructive device. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec is usually considered a post-impressionist, but here, you know, tilting up the composition, this garish green of the woman's face cut off on the front plane here, depicting this kind of seedy underbelly of bourgeois life, of dancing late at night, drinking absinthe. It's kind of like, whew, you know, got drunk and that's how you feel, is the world's tilting up and you are green in the face. And that's what Toulouse-Lautrec is capturing. So Van Gogh, similarly, he's playing with color, and he is a Dutch artist who spent some time in France, very much interested in his own feelings. He was raised by a preacher. He's a son of a preacher man. He starts off painting peasants in the Netherlands, the potato eaters here. And he talks about them as, I've tried to emphasize that these people eating their potatoes in the lamplight have dubbed the earth with those very hands they put into the dish. And so it speaks of manual labor and how they have honestly earned their food. He wrote that in a letter to his brother. And it's all browns, earth tones, like the potatoes. And then later, when he starts liberating color from reality, he is using it. When I say liberating from reality, I mean we don't actually see incandescent lights showing the light thrown off in the way that he is showing it. In the night cafe, he also wrote to his brother, quote, I have tried to express the terrible passions of humanity by means of red and green. The room is blood red and dark yellow with a green billiard table. Everywhere there is a clash and a contrast of the most disparate reds and greens in the figures of the little sleeping hooligans in the empty, dreary room, unquote. So he's really trying to capture the emotion of being in a gross bar, a poor bar. Again, the tilting up of the picture plane, the yellow floorboards, the green and red, as he says, the terrible passions of humanity captured. So many people are familiar with Starry Night, and I encourage you to go not only in your text to read about Starry Night, but also to access the many opportunities on Smart History about Starry Night. But this is it is a scene of his that he is combining his emotions about a scene outside of his window when he was in an insane asylum in southern France, in Saint-Remy. A cypress tree is in the foreground, and cypress trees are connotative of death. There seems to be a church spire behind that. And then, you know, when you think of stars in the sky and God and the infinite cosmos feeling small, yet death here in the cypress tree looming large. So there's very much some symbolism here. But in contrast to Cézanne, who, as I said, we want to think about the analytics of color, where he's actually using color in a way to kind of create an architecture of the composition. So the contrasts of green and red, or rather green and yellow, where warm colors advance and cool colors recede. So the warm of the yellow advancing to our eye and the cool green and blues recede. He's thinking about color as building blocks. I wanted to give you a sense of the texture of Van Gogh's work here with another work that I took when I was in Zurich. So here are some texture close-ups. So Cezanne, thinking about the architecture or the building of a composition through these almost geometric shapes of color, again with the warm advancing, the cool receding. Seurat, maybe you have seen this work in the Art Institute of Chicago. He also is using color theory, what he called the law of simultaneous contrasts of colors, to create this pointillism, or what he called divisionism. And here too, class is implicated, and we've talked about class a lot, especially in France, where the bourgeois here are coming to this aisle in the middle of the Seine River, but it seems like maybe here's a working class person based on dress lounging there. And this actually is a pendant or a pair to another work that Seurat did of working class laborers on the other side of the Seine. And it's a very different kind of composition where they're lounging, relaxed, and here you have all these verticals echoed by the trees in the back, very rigid. So you get a sense of the rigidity of the bourgeois versus this kind of relaxed nature of the proletariat. You saw in the video before break the Cult of Progress about Gauguin and how he went to Tahiti to try to find a quote-unquote primitive culture, Tahiti being a colony of France. And he tries to combine how he felt about what he found in Tahiti, which was not this paradise that he thought it would be, and what he actually saw. So you have like color in the foreground of this pool, and then that is clearly not real, but symbolic of emotion. And what is going on with these figures kind of on the middle ground? It seems like almost a dreamscape. So where do we come from? Where are we? Where are we going? Also, this synthesis of feelings about Tahiti, his own Christian background, reference to potentially the Garden of Eden and the picking of the apple of sin. It's a very complex picture. And he wrote about it too, thinking about all of these things, and even that question in his title. I think it would be useful if you wanted to choose your own comparison to kind of think about Gauguin as using color as symbolic of emotion, or the Impressionists like Renoir using light to capture fleeting moments, to capture the effects of light, or Cezanne as a post-impressionist using color to create an architecture, to create a geometric even structure to his compositions. So thinking about the different ways in which color and light are used in these, but understanding again that really there's only very few years difference between these. We've got 25 years. So this is all avant-garde. It's all post-impressionist and impressionist. And with that, I'm going to leave you for your second mini lecture.